Welcome, one and all. We're very excited to have you with us. Of course, you know this is sort of the high point of our lecture series each semester is when we have our author lecture for the book of the semester. You probably know, right, by now, should know that our book of the semester this fall is Exit from Hegemony, the Unraveling of the American Global Order. And we're very grateful to have the authors, Alexander Cooley and Daniel Nexon, here. Let me also just remind you that the Kennedy Center has lots of events and things going on. We invite you to stay up to date on what we're doing. Follow us on social media. Check out our website. I'll also remind you that this is International Education Week. And on our website, you can find a number of events listed from across campus that are celebrating that week. I'll also just remind you with one more time that, of course, next week is Thanksgiving week. We won't be having a lecture, but we'll invite you back 2 weeks from today when we will have a very interesting lecture by a man named William Bain. It's coming from Singapore, which should be interesting. And then following that, of course, the final Wednesday is when our Kennedy Research Fellows give their presentations. And these are students who have been doing research on the theme of our semester's lecture series, and those are always very interesting as well. So as I said, brief introductions. These are both distinguished political scientists with long, prolific lists of publications. But very briefly, Alexander Cooley is the Claire Tow Professor of Political Science at Barnard College and the director of Columbia University's Harriman Institute. His research examines how external actors have shaped the development and sovereignty of the former Soviet states with a focus on Central Asia and the Caucasus. Daniel Nexon is a professor of political science at Georgetown University. He has held fellowships at Stanford University's Center for International Security and Cooperation, and the Ohio State University's Mershon Center for International Studies. His work covers issues in international relations theory, American foreign policy, power politics, the politics of religious contention, and the relationship between popular culture and world politics. As I said, we're very grateful to have them here to share their work with us, and so please join me in welcoming them to BYU.
Is this working? Can you hear me okay? All right. Well, thank you so much for having us. I feel like I should be giving a long round of appreciation, but assume that I did. So we're obviously talking about our book, but we're also going to be talking about some arguments that we've been developing that are going to be appearing in Foreign Affairs in the January-February issue, and kind of extensions that we've done with the project since we have a new president. And the book was very much in some ways a product of the Trump administration. So I'm going to start with an overview. Our basic argument, if you're going to take away anything, it's that the United States is no longer a global hegemon. There's no going back to the 1990s and early 2000s when people thought that the United States bestrode the world like a colossus. What do I mean by hegemonic power? Probably most of you know what I mean, but basically, hegemony is just a term of art for leadership. It's derived from a Greek term for the leader of a military alliance. And when we talk about it, we sort of have a more technical meaning, in particular in international relations, which is we think of a hegemon as a state or potentially a coalition of states. You can have multiple states in like a cartel being a hegemon that uses superior capabilities to order, that is to regulate, set rules for, influence relations among and within other states. And so the United States is, everybody sort of agrees that the United States is playing that role, at least in part of the world now, and definitely played that role after the end of the Cold War at a global level. Now, when I say global hegemony is over, we mean global hegemony. We don't mean that the US won't remain a hegemonic power in the Americas, that it can't maintain a security hegemony in Europe, that it couldn't hang on to dollar hegemony, potentially. But what we mean is that the United States no longer has the unchallenged ability to influence events in the globe without a pure competitor. So we mean that the kind of global reach and global influence that the United States enjoyed, again in the 90s, early 2000s, is done. Often a lot of people want to read our argument as, the US is over, it's not going to be a great power anymore, and that's not at all what we mean. The second aspect of our argument is that processes of what we call hegemonic unraveling, that is the dissolution of the order established by the United States as a hegemon, have been underway for quite some time, and longer, I think, than we necessarily recognized. At least back 15 years, you can start to see these processes unfold. And there were a few people who were writing about things like rogue donors and other developments where they're saying, there's other states out there, and they're kind of playing a role like the United States, and that could have an implication for the ability of the United States to influence states the way that it wants to. Now, why is it on? Why? What's going on? Well, our argument here is not original at all. The fundamental reason why U.S. hegemony is eroding is an unfavorable shift in relative power away from the United States. And actually, it's not just the United States, it's the entire G7. Indeed, if you look nominally, the United States is kind of where it was 25 years ago. It's actually Europe that has its lost position. So we're talking broadly about a power shift away from the Atlantic towards Asia. And of course, the rise of China and the renewed interest of Russia in being a great power and the oil prices to sustain that great power ambition. But secondarily, there are specific policies that have slowed or accelerated unraveling. And one of those we think is the Iraq War, but we're going to talk about some other ones in the presentation. There are three major categories of processes or mechanisms that account for this unraveling, or three kinds of. The first is great power challengers. Russia, China, etc., which we call exit from above in the book. The second is the increasing leverage of weaker states in terms of the kinds of deals and relationships that they can have with the United States, which we call exit from below. And the third is the rise of counter-order movements, political movements and social movements, many of which are transnational in character, who want to remake order, and in some cases want to remake order in ways that are not compatible, we think, with continued US preeminence. And we call that exit from within. So briefly, what are we going to do? I'm going to start out by talking a little bit about international orders and hegemonic orders. I'll be passing off to Alex occasionally. We'll talk about what happened to international order in the 90s and what's reversed about that. We'll make an argument then about the overextension of liberal order and how the policy decisions that have to do with those dynamics, we'll explain what they are later, account for some of what's going on. And if we have time, we'll have concluding remarks. We tend to not have time, so maybe we'll just get to those in the Q&A. This is not we've not timed this presentation before, I warn you. Okay, so hegemony international order. This is some basic analytic throat clearing. What do we mean when we talk about international order? If you look at the sort of standard texts people go to, John Eikenberry's books on liberal Leviathan, After Victory. If you look at Hedley Bull's The Anarchical Society, which many people consider a touchstone for our modern discussions of international order, they will use phrases like rules, norms, and institutional arrangements. So we can think about order as being essentially predictability in the international system that is made possible by not everybody buys in, but the widespread knowledge of certain kinds of rules for which deviation from that behavior could be punished or could have negative repercussions, norms about appropriate behavior, norms that evaluate which states are higher in status and lower in status, and then institutions. In contemporary, we're talking about a whole range of multilateral institutions like the UN, NATO, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, IMF, World Bank, you name it. Now, we have a broader conception of international order. We think that international order doesn't just include this stuff. It includes a whole set of practices, logics of organization, relations, and networks that make up international politics. So our view of international politics is kind of like an ecosystem with all sorts of niches and all sorts of ties and relationships between the actors. So for example, there are alliance networks, but there are also intergovernmental networks in US defense cooperation that have individuals who have social relations and political relations with one another, interorganizational relationships. And indeed, as we argue in the book, those are incredibly important to US influence, those kind of more granular ties that cross the boundaries of states. The way we kind of distinguish this is we talk about the top, the sort of rules, norms, and institutional arrangements as being the architecture, like the design principles of international order. We talk about the other stuff as being the infrastructure. stuff that makes it run properly. And we think that there's been too much attention in the discussions about change in international order to rules, norms, and institutional arrangements, and not enough change to this kind of often hard to detect, often subtle, but hugely consequential reconfiguration of relations in international politics. Now, what are the sources of order? We think kind of anything. So we think you can get order through just as an emergent property of interactions, conflicts, and bargains among political communities, be the states, empires, city-states, what have you. We think they can be upheld and shaped by a cartel, coalition of state, concerts like the Concert of Europe is an order upholding arrangement, an order-making arrangement, an ordering arrangement, if you will. And then, of course, hegemonic powers. It's always some combination of all three. There are some accounts that sort of treat the hegemon as if it comes in and does everything on its own. That's empirically false. The United States was engaged in a lot of bargaining, for example, when it set up the post-World War II order, IMF, the Bretton Woods system, and things like that. Some people argue that you can't have order without this kind of enforcement. We disagree. We think that any kind of pattern behavior that's predictable is an order. And we think orders are there in all international systems, and they vary in interesting ways. But because of all these different sources of order and potential shaping ways that order gets shaped, hegemonic powers rarely create order whole cloth. Right? A lot of the work, I sort of alluded to this before, but a lot of the work that on power transition theory and hegemonic order theory basically has a story where there's a dominant power and there's a rising challenger, and eventually they meet, and oftentimes there's a war, and out of the debris of that war, there's either a new hegemon or the old hegemon, and there's a new order created, usually in a peace treaty and agreement. So we think about the post-World War II arrangement, or we think about the League of Nations, or we think about the concert system even. Some people argue that the UK played initially a hegemonic role before it pulled out of that arrangement, or even people argue that Westphalia might be this. But they just don't think this is right. We think order evolves and changes over time. We think that orders can look the same superficially but be different underneath. This is John Rugby's insight. And we think that hegemons emerge in an order that already exists, and they're responsive and constrained by that order. Or as we would put it, international order, both prior to the hegemonic ordering and after the hegemonic ordering project, creates opportunities for hegemons, but also constraints. It's not just subordinate polities that are affected by international order, it's dominant actors. So the United States is both a shaper of international order, but it's also a taker of international order. It follows, if in hegemonic systems, that eroding hegemonic orders can weaken the incumbent power. So as we're going to try to argue throughout inter alia, contestation over international order is relevant to US power. And it's relevant to the persistence of US hegemony in a variety of different ways. Okay, so why contest international order? Well, one is that orders produce military and economic advantages from states. This is what I was alluding to before. Dollar hegemony, which gives the United States an enormous advantage in terms of its ability to debt finance or its ability to influence other states. The US alliance and basing network. The United States is a global power that's hugely dependent upon a series of alliances and bases. On its own, it doesn't have anywhere near the kinds of capabilities to power and project or the economic influence that it has when it works together with its alliances and with its partners. Also, orders privilege different types of regimes, cultures, and norms. So actors may not like order because they think it's dismissive of their cultural values, or they might not like order because the characteristics that order values is not stuff that they have. So they're lower on the status hierarchy, lower on the totem pole. It can affect legitimacy. So if you're in an order like today's order, the liberal order, such as it is, the liberal order treats democracy as kind of if you look at the treaties and the arrangements, there's a sort of baked-in assumption that democracy is the ideal political form. It's there, and it's not actually all that subtle if you read the kinds of propositions that are encoded in those treaties. And that can be a problem if you're an authoritarian state. That can mean that the order has a sort of constant low-level threat to your legitimacy. Yeah, that's what I was going to say. I told you I haven't practiced this yet. So that's the argument I just made. And power transitions can exacerbate all of this because during you not only have winners and losers in orders, but during power transitions you have new sets of winners and new sets of losers. So states Their citizens who might have felt they were powerful beforehand are starting to feel weak. People who felt weaker are feeling like if things go the way they go, we're going to be able to dominate the world maybe, and they have expectations that could be problematic. And so both the winners and losers and the new round of people who are anxious states, actors, other actors who are anxious, who are worried, or who may be optimistic, that creates a whole set of possible grievances or desires to change things. So Alex, do you want to talk about the strategies of contestation?
Yeah, sure. And thanks so much again for this opportunity. So basically we identify two strategies of contestation that other powers have when confronted with an order that they don't like or that they want to transform or outright revise. First is order contestation, where you try to change order from within, right? And essentially this means you try and take the relative consensus that there is at the core of the order, here it's the liberal West, and change those norms, change those values, change the system of communities, political alliances, institutions that are valued, right? So change from within is a basic part of order contestation. However, as with our ecological metaphor, another way to go is that you ignore the core of the present order and you start building your own. This is alternative order building. You make a different order on your own terms. You start to build out, say, new international institutions and regional organizations that promote your values, your interests, right? Not the ones of the dominant state. So these two mechanisms, these two strategies are analytically distinct, but together they can have powerful transformative effects. And they also reinforce one another. And I want to give you an example. Let's start giving you some real examples in international politics now to go with all this theory and analysis. What is Russia's revisionist strategy? We talk about the Russians a lot having a revisionist strategy. We have pictures of Vladimir Putin here. And oftentimes we try and focus on one thing. The Russians are trying to do this. The Russians are trying to do this. Actually, the Russians have a very multivariate strategy on how they pursue international order. On the one hand, they are trying to contest the order from within by weakening support, say for NATO or the European Union within the core liberal order. And this is a meeting that Putin is having with leaders of Liga, an Italian party that does not support NATO, right? And here, the Russians are ideological. They support parties from the left and parties from the right that are anti-EU and anti-NATO. At the same time, though, the Russians are constructing their own alternative orders, right? So they build alliances, economic networks, institutions that are sort of mimicked on the West, but their substance and their purpose is very different. So this is a map of what's known as the Eurasian Economic Union, the EAEU, which was set up after the great financial crisis and established in 2014 to be a geoeconomic rival to the EU, the European Union. There is a similar kind of supranational court system, commission. They have a free trade agreement, common customs. They're moving towards a common currency. They have a common migration policy. And in this case, it includes Russia, Kazakhstan, Armenia, Kyrgyzstan, and Belarus. And they're negotiating some individual deals with countries like Vietnam, with Egypt, with Iran. So the short answer is that Russia is doing both, right? It's not just focused in on the West. It's trying to do its own alternative order construction. So in general, what's happened to international order over the last, especially 15, 20 years? What's happened to the clicker? Here we go. We call this the great reversal of the late Cold War and the post-Cold War era. In the 1990s, one of the dominant aspect of international order was what we call the American and Western patronage monopoly. What does this mean? It means we controlled everything. We controlled international financial institutions, who got emergency loans and development assistance. We controlled the standards by which we judge your elections as being fair and free. We controlled the different norms and values that we took into the United Nations and tried to spread them around. we basically set the rules in both architectures and infrastructures for that. The other thing that happened in the late Cold War is that there used to be another order provider in international politics during the Cold War. It was the Soviet Union. Soviet Union just collapsed. But it wasn't just the Soviet Union that collapsed with the resulting fragmentation of Russia and sort of 15 post-Soviet states. It was all the ordering that the Soviet Union used to do also disappeared. The Soviet Union used to provide development finance. It used to provide networks of expertise and standards, of course, arms sales. So you had this entire pillar of order drop out, and the US becomes the only game in town. Finally, you have liberal pro-order transnational movements and activists. So in the 1990s, it became very fashionable in international relations to talk about NGOs being a great third actor, neither states nor private companies, and they were incredibly powerful, or so it seemed like in the 1990s. Why? Because principled activists could network with similar-minded activists in the Global South, in United Nations, in friendly countries. And there was a sense that these liberal transnational movements and activists, and Catherine Sicke and Margaret Keck wrote a very influential book on this called Activists Beyond Borders in 1997. And their main thesis was that they were quite nimble, that they could even get reluctant authoritarian governments and put pressure on them in support for expanding liberal values, right? And they talked about human rights, they talked about gender equality, and they talked about the environment in their book. So what we've seen in terms of our ordering is really the reversal of all of these. The US does not have a patronage monopoly anymore. Think about China, its Belt and Road Initiative, the commitment to $1 trillion worth of infrastructure spending in over 65 partner countries. We have multiple patrons in other areas that we don't typically think of as sort of providing goods. So for instance, one area that I'm really interested in is election monitoring, right? Used to be just the US monitored elections and volunteers, and we would get straight accounts. Well, in the part of the world I study, latest election in Kazakhstan had 45 election monitors, right? And some of them came from China, some of them came from Russia, some of them came from these outfits you never heard before because they were just paid to monitor elections and issue a good verdict. And in the end, the traditional election observer, which the US influenced from the OSCE, was just the only one out of over 40 that had any negative things to say about a very flawed election. And in fact, the president of Kazakhstan said, well, don't listen to that assessment. Everyone else said it was totally fine. Now you might think, well, is anyone going to believe Chinese election monitors coming in and commenting on the quality of a Central Asian election? Our point is not whether there's credibility or not. Our point is that multiple patrons are now offering these things that the US exclusively did. In this alternative order building now, countries, even what we consider to be weaker countries, have options. They can pick and choose from these other sources of goods and political and sources of political legitimacy. And I think there's a couple of related points here. One is, if you're a weaker country and you see that you have options, right, you can play one patron off another. You can say, hey, United States, China's offering us this. Why don't you give us a better deal? So you can ask for more stuff, but you can also ask for deals that are less intrusive and less damaging to you politically, right? You can say, hey, United States, we want the money, but we don't want these like pesky human rights conditions, right? We don't want you telling us like we can't end subsidies for foodstuffs, like or IMF conditionality. What happened in the 1990s was that, and a lot of research backs this up, conditions, the imposition of economic and political conditions from organizations like the World Bank and IMF became actually very strict and very credible. All of a sudden now, countries have other options. And then finally, we see, sorry, Dan. I did not follow the PowerPoint. Yeah. And finally, we see there are no longer just liberal NGOs and transnational activists, that transnational activism is actually going in all sorts of directions. And many of them are now in the realm of counter-ordering. In other words, transnationalism has become contested. Let's go to the next one. So let's look at some of these mechanisms in practice, or the politics of goods substitution, and come up with a few kind of real-world examples. So hegemonic powers have this quasi-monopoly and this provision of what we call international public goods, club goods, and private goods, and in the security, the economic, the cultural realm. Next. And in the unipolar moment, the US was the only actor capable of providing these, right? This is also true in the security sphere. And ordering international politics is a matter of providing carrots, right? We'll provide you the goods, or we will threaten to withhold the goods if you don't play along, right? If you don't acknowledge our rule sets, if you don't get along board with our projects. And in the 1990s, the US and the Europeans leveraged this position, this patronage monopoly, to push liberal values. And in fact, if you think about the NATO and EU enlargement process of the late 1990s, 2000s, right? What were the preconditions for these post-communist countries joining NATO and the EU? They had to adopt 20,000 pages worth of conditions, right? Yeah, you can join the European Union. Here's what you need to do. Everything from how are you going to treat your minorities to the size of plastic bags that bread is going to be bagged in, right? You don't have to join, but if you do want to join, that's the deal. That's the script. Next. So, good substitution. Now, all of a sudden, politics is a lot messier. So, pop quiz. Who's this gentleman here? Duterte, president of the Philippines. This gentleman is especially interesting to us because the Philippines has been a longtime ally, traditional ally of the US in the Pacific. But Duterte has this kind of populist appeal. He makes it a point to talk about the need to cooperate with China and Russia. He actually plays kind of footsies with the Chinese over different sort of maritime disputes. And he cancels the visiting forces agreement with the United States, which now then he has gone to sort of back and reinstated. But it's this constant pendulum back and forth. The United States, we have options in both the security and the economic sphere. And he equates strengthening the sovereignty of his country and his whole style with being multipolar, right? Not being based in any one country. We include this slide. This is super interesting. This came out just before the pandemic. This was a survey carried by Radio Free Europe and Liberty in Serbia, right? Country in the Balkans. And they asked Serbian citizens, who gives the most aid to your country? And according to respondents, a plurality, 40% said China. China gives the most aid to Serbia. Really? EU, 18%. Russia, 15%. What are the actual results? Actually, it's not even close. The EU gives about 90% of aid to Serbia. Yet there is this perception in Serbia because of information, disinformation streams, Chinese propaganda, if you want to call it, but also local politicians saying we need to be more multipolar, that actually China gives more goods than they actually do. So sometimes it's about the perception of change, not even actual change. And then finally, the conflict in Ukraine in 2014, when this government collapsed, this pro-Russian government, and was replaced in the Maidan revolution. Viktor Yanukovych, what's his name, was perceived to be kind of a Kremlin stooge and lackey. But really what had been going on was there was a tug of war between the European Union and between Russia over whose economic ordering project, remember when I showed Eurasian Economic Union, whose economic ordering project Ukraine was going to join to. And it was the fact that Yanukovych rejected the EU partnership, right, that led to the Maidan uprisings. So that was essentially the Ukraine revolution, a battle over whose public goods to subscribe to. Next. Great power contestation. So here, power exit from above, right? Russia and China are creating their own ordering projects. I mentioned Russia. I mentioned the Belt and Road. In the book, we show vectors and maps of the countries that have joined Chinese and Russian initiatives over the last 20 years, and they tend to be concentrated mostly in Central and South Europe. So you're creating new institutions, the BRICS, the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. There's too many to list, but they're there. But at the same time, having these alternative order building platforms then affords the Chinese more leverage in traditional institutions that you might think the United States still controls. This is a map from the book of the vote in the UN Human Rights Council over condemning China over its Xinjiang re-education camps. Yeah, over 1 million people have passed through these. Some have termed them as part of a cultural genocide. And so in the UN Human Rights Council, the green countries, initially, 21 of them, issue a statement condemning China. And the United States is not here because they were not part of the UN Human Rights Council. They've joined it since. 3 weeks later, the Chinese bring their counter letter of 37 signatories, soon to become 52 a couple of weeks later, saying, no, the camps are totally fine, and in fact, China is an outstanding upholder of the UN human rights system. Those are the countries in red. Countries in green are the traditional liberal order countries. It's Canada, Australia, New Zealand, Japan, Scandinavia, Western Europe. But look at the countries in red. Look at the continents they span. Latin America, Africa, Middle East, Eurasia, Russia, of course. Next. And then rolling back this liberal civil society, sort of the backlash against the activists, kind of a 3-step process. Well, countries figured out after the publication of Activists Beyond Borders that, you know what, these NGOs, they're kind of pesky and they're kind of annoying. And we actually don't want to deal with them anymore. That's what the Russians decided. So they passed a law in 2012 calling a foreign agent law. So if you are an NGO, you take money from outside, you have to announce it. You have to brand yourself a foreign agent, right? This is Memorial with graffiti that was scrawled on it, Иностранный агент, foreign agent. And that was soon followed up by a law called the Criminal Organizations Law. Now we're just going to ban you. In fact, over 70 countries have passed NGO restriction laws in the last 15 years. Yeah, this idea that somehow NGOs were seamless, they were more nimble than states, they could boomerang around. No. First stage is inoculation. Ground the activists, interdict the NGOs. Step 2, make your own. You know what? We don't need liberal NGOs, we can make our own. Is this a slide of? Nash Weber, Our Choice, with Putin on top. This is the youth group in Russia called Nashi. And Nashi is a Kremlin project. They're put together after the so-called color revolution in Ukraine, where the perception was that these Western-sponsored NGOs sort of destabilize the government. And what you see in Russia, as well as a number of countries now, is this kind of government-sponsored NGOs that emphasize national values, that emphasize sovereignty, and again, have the kind of like anti-liberal agenda. Step 3, where we say flood the zone, right? No, that's all right. We'll, no, not the Xinjiang map again. And flood the zone basically means you take your gongos now and you do battle against the liberal NGOs. Where do you do battle? Domestically, but also in international fora, right? Places like the OSCE, Human Rights Agenda. Actually, most of the speaking organizations there are no longer human rights NGOs. They're gongos from Kazakhstan, Azerbaijan, and so forth, saying how awesome their NGOs are. And they take agendas also to the UN. So it's contestation all the way down. How are we doing here?
I've been talking for a while.
All right.
I mean, one of the things, obviously, when we talk about flooding the zone, we're obviously making reference to Russian efforts to engage in information warfare against Western societies. We're talking about meddling in elections. We're talking about essentially the strategy of exacerbating social cleavages. So there have been really wonderful, really interesting studies of Russian troll activity, which finds that you go into what the Russian trolls do is they go into a Black Lives Matter debate and they take the most extreme positions on both sides. Right? Try to just make people yell at each other and be angry at each other. The same thing on vaccines. Actually, even before the controversies over the COVID-19 vaccine. And if you remember these sort of weird things about sponsoring like a Texas secessionism group and a California secession group, sort of a throw things at the wall strategy, but it's all about trying to destabilize, disorder, sow confusion, erode public trust. And the thing is that this is, of course, linking up with a whole bunch of other the Russians couldn't do anything if there weren't people upset about the current order on the ground. And when we say this, we mean that when we talk about exit from within, we're talking about counter-order movements that are in the tradition, even though they're transnational, they extend into Africa and Latin America and elsewhere. Primarily, we're interested in the ones that are operating in the core itself, that are influencing politics in the so-called Western liberal democracies. And one of the arguments I just want to put forward for you is that we need to broaden our understanding of international order. When we think about what's going on, the stuff that Alex is talking about, NGO restrictions and its effect on international ordering by changing the makeup of the various kinds of civil society actors who are influencing the character of order, and in a sense, it's order all the way down. That the US domestic order is embedded within an international order in the same way that other countries are. And people, even in those countries, some of their grievances and their reasons for voting the way they do and the things that they are struggling against have to do with international order. So opposition to NATO, opposition to the European Union, opposition to Britain being in the European Union, opposition to global finance, right, in capital mobility, opposition to various aspects of order that we would think of as international order at the domestic level. So we need to broaden our understanding of that and look at a lot of the movements that are operating in the United States right now on both sides of the political aisle as being not just responses to domestic politics, but responses more broadly to international order and features of international order. And when we say that they're counter-order, it doesn't necessarily mean that these movements are bad, right? I mean, I'm sure some of you think that CRT, is critical race theory, is something that needs to be banned and it's bad. I don't know if any of you support Sanders. I worked on his campaign, his first campaign. People might have views from afar of Brexit, but they all represent disquiet with the order, a sense of the distribution of goods not going correctly, a sense of loss of status. Is what the polling and data showed in both Europe and the United States is driving populist movements. And that is essentially isomorphic. It's homologous with what's happening internationally. So why are people feeling like they don't have the same status they do? Some of that is what's happening internationally, and some of that's being in former world powers or in world powers that are losing their privileged position. So there's a lot kind of intermixing going on here. And that kind of contestation, we won't go into it in great detail, I'll do it during the Q&A, but that contestation we think is actually really significant. Potentially more significant than everything else that we've talked to you about, if you look historically. Now, the last thing we wanted to talk about, do you want to do this? I mean, this is sort of,
let's do this quick.
So is that these are all sort of secular things that are happening. They're structural things. They're all about other actors mostly. They're not about liberal states themselves. But we said we wanted to talk about some policies that were adopted in the pursuit of liberal order that we think actually backfired, created resentment, and undermined liberal order. And we call these sort of the overextending of liberal order. So the first were a set of policies that securitized liberal order, that made international order a threat. We talked about the inoculation strategies, the way that a lot of authoritarian states both started to protect themselves. They even turned some of those policies on the Western order, the way that China and Russia are trying to strip human rights protections out of, say, UN peacekeeping mandates in the UN and sort of take the human rights out of the international order. Jessica Weiss describes this as making the international order safe for Chinese authoritarianism, or more broadly, making international order safe for authoritarian regimes, this liberal international order. Well, for a long time, those states were fairly content to live within a broadly liberal order. It was pesky, it was annoying, the NGOs could be a thorn in your side, but it wasn't that big a deal. And a series of actions that the US took actually securitized international order, made liberal order seem like an existential threat. And the first of those took place under the Bush administration, the second under the Obama administration. So under the Bush administration, you will recall the invasion of Iraq is a militarized promotion of democracy, which raised the specter of the United States no longer pushing democracy in nice, fluffy ways that you could really deal with, but it was actually using force to export democracy. For a lot of authoritarian states, there's no reason to believe that they might not eventually be targets of that force themselves. So that starts to be kind of threatening. The broader freedom agenda was not just about the use of force, it was about support for counter-revolutions and for organizing in authoritarian regimes, particularly in the former Soviet Union. And these, the US backing for these revolutions, the Orange Revolution in Ukraine, the Rose Revolution in Georgia, really sent signals to authoritarians throughout the region that they could be next. And that the United States was interested in regime change. When I worked in the Department of Defense in Russia, the Russia-Ukraine-Eurasia office of OSD policy, we spent a lot of time trying to tell countries in the regime, including Russia, that we weren't interested in transforming the regime. But they didn't buy that because they'd seen the behavior, right? And they knew that that was always a possibility. Things just get worse under Obama. Because what does Obama do in the Arab Spring? They are a little equivocal, but they do support a number of Arab Spring uprisings. They tell Mubarak he has to step down. They put pressure on Egypt to actually let the Muslim Brotherhood win an election, which sets off all sorts of alarm bells. The intervention in Libya is a huge deal because not only did the United States make promises to Russia and China about what they were authorizing that then got violated, that it wasn't going to be regime change. But the story is that somebody like Putin looks at Muammar Gaddafi being killed by his own people and he sees himself there. Right? And so this was in many ways a decisive moment in transferring that relationship. Activity in Syria. All of these things combine in a set of waves to convince other authoritarian states that they can no longer live with liberal order, and certainly not with American-led liberal order. And that's when a lot of these policies start, in 2012, for example. Of course, we can't ignore the European Union in this story. It's not just about the United States. Normative power Europe, EU constitutes itself as a beacon of liberal power, swaying things by its moral superiority, which sounds great if you're European, but doesn't sound so great if you're a regime that is illiberal on its borders. Moreover, the EU strategy was sort of, even though they thought, you've talked to EU officials, they think that they were doing was totally benign, it was a win-win for everybody, but it was sort of a relentless expansion into space that Russia considered its privileged sphere of influence. Trying to bring Ukraine into the EU orbit, right? For them, this was just, it was just what they do. It's nice, it's great. We'll have more trade. It's good for Russia. They'll have more trade conduit through the Ukraine to the EU, and Ukraine will be doing better. It will be a better market for Russian goods. Of course, the Russians saw this as an attempt to wrest Ukraine away from their sphere of influence and to shut down their own ordering project. They actually had gotten Armenia to nix the association agreement a couple weeks beforehand. And so the EU itself, in many ways, is a much bigger threat than NATO, because the EU represents a community around liberal values and trade, which is incredibly prosperous on Russia's doorstep, where former Soviet states that are in it and former Warsaw Pact states that are in it are doing much better than states that aren't. And so the EU has a lot to answer for in terms of this securitizing liberal order. The second is the proliferation of liberal values. Do you want to talk about this?
Yeah, I would do that quickly. So what we see is the gradual expansion of the kinds of rights under the architecture part over the years. So at the Cold War end, we talk about
I know the order.
Oh, you do. Okay.
So
we did not rehearse.
So if you think about what liberal order building meant in the 1990s, it meant economic and political openness. Right? It meant you had to open your markets and you had to hold elections. And you had to protect some civil rights that went along with being a democracy, but it wasn't really that much, all things considered. It was a very kind of core consensus understanding of liberal order, at least at the time.
I mean, this is the end of history moment, right?
This is the time when the U.S. is the only system left. It's the victorious system. Everybody thinks they have to emulate it, or they'll be in trouble. And what is the U.S. selling? They're selling have elections, don't massacre your people, and open your markets, which is actually a relatively small set of liberal values. This immediately begins to increase. You have the women's rights agenda pushed by Hillary Clinton, going to Beijing and admonishing Beijing about forced abortions, I think, actually, and forced sterilization. And you have also the emergence after Rwanda and Yugoslavia of responsibility to protect doctrine. Right? This idea that actually not only were you not supposed to massacre your own citizens, but maybe you lost your sovereignty if you did that, and other states had the right to intervene. So liberal order starts to kind of add a bunch of rights that aren't quite as consensus, certainly in other parts of the world, right? Then you move into the 2000s, and the Bush administration gets really confusing. We won't talk about that because they're sort of got things pushing in different directions with the Bush administration because of the war on terror. But then you get to the Obama administration, and particularly the second term of the Obama administration, and suddenly you've got LGBTQ rights on the table. You've got so you've got treatment of sexual minorities. You have a notion of expanded rights that include refugees and migrants much more robustly. And these things are really quite controversial in a lot of places in the world, not just at home. So essentially, it's set up liberal order to be in opposition to cultural conservatism, including cultural conservatives in places like the Czech Republic and Hungary. And in Georgia, this is from a riot, an anti-gay riot in Georgia that broke out a couple of weeks ago, right? Who sort of like NATO, like the EU, but this is kind of a bridge too far for them, right? And I have friends who were talking to Czech diplomats right after Trump was elected, and they're like, and they basically, thank God, we're not going to have to listen to the Obama administration lecture us on trans rights, essentially. And this is, of course, controversial at home as well. The expansion of liberal rights to all of these different things gave populist regimes wedge issues, right? Because if liberal order is only a small set of rights that everybody kind of agrees on, it's hard to kind of use it, weaponize it. But if it's kind of everything under the sun, right, then you can choose what populists can do is they can choose the least popular rights, the elements of liberal order that protect the people who everybody in their country hates, for example, and seize on that and attack that as their wedge against liberal order and for populism. We're going to protect you against the gays. We're going to protect you against migrants. We're going to protect you against Islam, that sort of thing. Moreover, it provided this is Alex's favorite part of the whole thing. So it not only provided a wedge issue for populists, that's a picture from that's a billboard in Hungary, but it actually, authoritarian regimes got smart about this. They realized that they could use elements of the rights agenda to discredit other elements of the rights agenda. So Navalny, who is what's his first name?
Alexei Navalny.
Alexei Navalny, who is like the main opposition guy in Russia. About a couple months ago, 6 months ago, all of a sudden there was this stuff going all over the press, right? Coming through Twitter on some of the alternative press in the United States that he was a racist, that he hated Central Asian migrants, which was kind of true, but that's kind of par for the course for Russian politicians. But that campaign was successful in convincing Amnesty International to withdraw his prisoner of conscience status, to repudiate him, even though he's the most powerful force for democratization right now in Russia. And then they walked it back. Yes, this is from their press release. So it's not just all of these kinds of things that are happening with the economy and goods provision and things like that. There are also ways in which the United States and the European Union kind of went all in on massive expansion of liberal rights, that whether you agree with them or not, I agree with most of these policy positions, did start to produce cracks in support for the liberal order in places that were generally pretty fond of it, and also became a vector for backlash, and has also become, frankly, a vector for backlash in this country among groups who don't like NATO, don't like aspects of the liberal democratic order, think Orban's pretty awesome, that sort of thing. And a lot of that is about the same kinds of cultural fights we're having here.
We should wrap it.
And that's it. I mean, we've been talking for a long time.
Yep.
Let's do the Q&A.
So can I just ask a quick question? So what's happening with the transition from Trump to Biden and this whole thing?
Yeah. Great question.
Our actual concluding slide has a picture of Biden saying America's back, and and then we have a kind of comment across it, back to what, right? We think that the Biden administration understands intellectually, because we know some of these people, that it's a very different distribution of power and it's a very different world out there. But that doesn't seem to us to be translating much into practice, right? It seems to be that the US is kind of going back to what it was doing, since the 90s in a lot of its behavior, with the exception of getting even tougher on Russia and China, right? And so there's a way in which we're not sure that the Biden administration has really internalized the kinds of effects that what's already happened has on American capabilities, American influence, and how America
Yeah.
ought to engage with the world.
Yeah, let me give you a couple of examples. One is the signature normative move, the Summit for Democracy, where you're inviting all the democracies, and Viktor Orban was not invited, right? And sort of as a sign of opprobrium. Well, in a different era, in the 1990s, if you're a country that's excluded from a US-led Summit for Democracy, you're going to have some explaining to do, especially to your populations. This is going to be an issue that's going to be used against you. Now, for the Russians, the Chinese, Orban, this is a badge of honor. Yeah, you guys have your Summit for Democracy, sure, right? And then we can talk about something real. In other words, there's a sense that even by having this summit, you are encouraging a contestation of it, right? And I can already see sort of, Russian First Channel having a field day with all the contradictions, who's a democracy, who isn't, what horrible things have they done. That's one example. The second example is this belief, and we have some of this in this forthcoming foreign affairs piece, this belief in kind of preserving openness, and that somehow liberal values win out when you have kind of open governance. And there's some cases where that might be true, but in most cases it fosters contestation. And in some cases, for example, the global media environment, authoritarians now have gained the upper hand. Why? Because it's asymmetrical openness. So authoritarians can kick out our correspondents, right? BBC or New York Times or so forth, if they don't like the coverage, but they can completely cover us. And in fact, they subsidize their global media networks to the tunes of hundreds of millions of dollars every year, with 23 bureaus in Africa alone. Chinese TV has. Now you might say, well, we don't, that's also our fault for not giving sort of, our global media the attention and care it needs. But we have a much more hands-off view of sort of openness. It should be left to the market. So there is this sense that sometimes openness is not actually upholding the order there was in the 1990s, that it's actually feeding into these contestation dynamics. So I would say those are two examples under Biden. But I think Biden's, the Biden agenda in general is this trying to sort of support these kinds of different ordering infrastructures and architectures, at least rhetorically.
They're understaffed. They're making mistakes.
My name is Jacob Kinman. I'm a political science student, specifically focused on comparative politics and international relations. I'm curious what you guys think, if there's any possible pushback for liberal democracies into trying to keep themselves in the well, obviously it's the United States was in a hegemonic role, but liberal democracy itself being spread, or is it just a given that Russia, China, and other illiberal states are going to be taking the hegemonic role?
It's a great question.
Yeah.
It's a great question. I think there needs to be a little, we need to adopt a little more of a medium-term outlook on this. And Dan and I think are on the same page on this, in that you can't compete everywhere. If you set up global great power competition as a battle between democracies and autocracies, then everywhere is sort of high stakes, right? And anywhere, China is partnering with Ecuador, oh my God, we got to pay off the Ecuadorians. We got to pay off the Sri Lankans. We have to be involved. And part of what we'd like to do, yes, we need to be consistent in our principles, but we also need to let China and Russia make mistakes, right? There's not a lot of contentment out there with really heavy-handed wolf warrior diplomacy, or sort of China appropriating strategic ports, or buying off politicians, right? Or some of the things Russia very aggressively does. And so in some ways what we can do is, when these projects and these engagements fail, we need to be there as an alternative option and say, well, there's another model that's available. But what I think we shouldn't do is, in this rush to compete, then kind of throw everything out the window and just say, at all costs, prevent the Russians from being in Sudan, right? Or whatever the latest thing happens to be. So I would like to see us think of this over the medium term a little bit, and allow the great power competitors to make their mistakes and show some of their own kind of scars and contradictions.
Thank you.
Yep.
Hi, my name is Evangelia, and I'm a political science and economics student. Just one question. How does the United States and other G7 powers accept the shift in hegemonic power while still promoting human rights and less extreme liberal values? And the second kind of similar question is the goal of this whole process a return to American homogeny?
American hegemony.
Yeah, you want to take that last one?
Well, I think the major answer we have to the first one is what Alex was saying. We think that we have a piece in the national interest that's really short. It's called, like we should play rope-a-dope, right? And the idea is, just that we think the United States will do best when it upholds its principles at home and abroad, and makes those principles attractive, and lets these other ways of doing things show their warts. So we think there's plenty of room to uphold liberal rights, to support democracies that want support. I mean, it's not democracy is, there's a lot of backsliding going on, but we're still talking about backsliding. I mean, if you want to talk about, people who think that, the United States is like one step away from authoritarianism, I don't know, but if you look at voting rights, we're still much more democratic than we were 30 years ago by any stretch of the imagination. I mean, sorry, by 50 years, in the 1960s, by any stretch of the imagination, right? Hungary is backslid, but it's a soft authoritarianism. It's not, Stalin. Law and justice has an unfair playing field that lets them kind of win elections that probably should be, they should be losing if it were a fair playing field. But that's better than a lot of alternatives. So we shouldn't despair about this stuff.
Yeah.
And I think that we should really stand up for principles, and that I think is what we should do, right? Rhetorically, we should show up, and we should be at the UN. We shouldn't pull out of the Human Rights Council, right, in a tiff. We should be there voicing what we believe, right, even if we're going to lose.
Yeah.
And we should accept that we're going to lose a fair amount.
And on the strict human rights issues, these countries signed these treaties of their own accord, right? I mean, they signed the Anti-Torture Convention, right? No, we didn't make them sign it. And so I think, at least keeping the system of holding countries accountable to those things that they've signed up for. Other things they haven't signed up for, and they're contesting. But there needs to be that kind of distinction too.
Very briefly, so I mean, we think that within the realm of the confidence interval, right, sort of outcomes, most of them have the United States being either the first or second most powerful country in the world, right, which isn't exactly small beans. So the United States continued to being able to exercise hegemony in some spheres, and perhaps in some geographic regions, depending on how the politics play out, or exercise leadership. It may not be as intrusive as it once was, and that's not a bad place to be. That's the 90s. The unipolar period was really unusual. And it was really contingent. It was really this weird artifact of the Soviet Union imploding. And we shouldn't expect to see that happen all the time. And we shouldn't expect the world to be naturally unipolar, right? And so, I guess I would say that the United States can be first among equals. It can be incredibly influential. If it does better solving its myriad domestic problems than the Chinese do, it'll be well positioned. So yeah, I mean, I think I just don't think the kind of way we could look at the world and treat and act towards the world is going to come back. And we shouldn't assume that it is, and we shouldn't try to make it so. Is I guess what we would say. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, that's perfect. Thank you.
I'm Leslie Hadfield. I'm a professor in the history department. I'm wondering what you think the U.S. pulling out of Afghanistan signifies in all of this.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, we debated. We're glad we didn't add another slide to the presentation. But so we thought Afghanistan was to come up. Look, I think Afghanistan's kind of a perfect illustration of then and now. So let's just take support for the war on terror in 2011. We all of a sudden set up military bases in Central Asia, go in Afghanistan, and we get both Chinese and Russian buy-in. Why? For their own interests, right? The Russians wanted to be seen as a partner of the US back then, as an interlocutor with the Central Asian countries. The Chinese wanted to graft their anti-Xinjiang campaign onto the war on terror, which they did quite successfully, right? They got these Uyghur movements listed as terrorist movements, including on the State Department list. Sean Roberts has a really good book about this out. So it suited them, but they didn't contest the move, right? Over the next 20 years, however, both Russia and China in Central Asia really started building their own ordering fabrics. A bunch of new regional organizations in the security sphere and the economic sphere. Informal ties, regional initiatives, networks. Russia actually started hosting Taliban talks a few years ago, even before the collapse of the Kabul government. So when the US withdrew, it wasn't 2001 anymore. Yes, the Taliban was left, but there was all this other ordering going on. So the SCO and the Russians are having these cross-border training exercises to sort of signal to the Taliban, you guys have Afghanistan, but absolutely, no more than this. China's doing a deal with the Taliban, basically saying, we'll build you a road network the way we're really good at, but you have to take care of these 2,000 Uyghurs for us, which is the main quid pro quo that the Chinese have. So all this to say, is it going to be sort of super stable and completely coordinated? No. It's going to be a humanitarian disaster, unfortunately. But at the same time, I think there are mechanisms there that we're not a part of, right? And they, by the process of having to rely on them now, you're going to see this more and more. And I think the final one is the normative one. People are saying, well, Russia will never accept the Taliban, right? Because it has its own fears against Islamic terrorism. It's not strictly true. It's a very selective reading. Yes, Russia has a fear and views Islamic terrorism as a threat in certain contexts, but look what it did in Chechnya, right? Bombed the heck out of it, subdued them, it co-opted them, and now Kadyrov can do whatever he wants to there, as long as he's loyal to the center. He can use whatever Islamic symbols he wants, kind of imagery and so forth. They're totally cool with that, and I think it'll be the same with the Taliban too.
But I do think in the 2000s, the Russians were more concerned
Yes.
about Islamic terrorism.
Absolutely.
And they were really concerned about Pakistan's nuclear
Yep.
weapons falling into the hands of somebody who was sympathetic to the Chechens or
Yep.
some such, or somebody in Dagestan, one of the North Caucasus. And I think the fact that that's just like, the U.S. is just the bigger threat now.
Yeah.
And that's kind of, I think, the nub of that.
It's like everyone agrees that whatever threat the Taliban is, they prefer to have the U.S. out. China agrees, Russia agrees, Iran agrees. Like on that fundamental thing.
Thank you.
Yeah.
So I'll ask a question for Leslie.
Eric, why don't you just do the microphone?
Yeah.
Sure, everyone can hear it.
Leslie's a ringer, I'm sure.
Leslie's, she coordinates the Africana Studies program, and she asked about Afghanistan. I do the Asian Studies program, so I'll ask an Africa question. that is, sort of, what is your general assessment of these alternative ordering principles, especially for, say, China, for example? What kind of traction are they getting in Africa?
Yeah.
Africa has just been a place that decades we've never got anywhere with. The United States has never really gotten anything off the ground very much. And China seems to be, but yet there's pushbacks. What's your assessment of the traction China's getting with this alternative ordering principles in Africa?
Yeah, it's a great question. We're starting to find out as we see more and more papers generated off the aid database with some of the sort of the geolocation of some of the survey data and so forth. But in general, there are expectations of both greater investment and greater corruption associated with Chinese investment. Like, they're not contradictory. Like, African attitudes sort of see both. I mean, I think that's what we've sort of seen.
But what I had more in mind is sort of longevity. Is burn very, very bright? Is it going to burn out very quickly, or do you think China's got some good traction and this will go on for a long, long time?
China's been in Africa for a really long time, actually.
Yeah. No, I mean,
from back in the Cold War era, right?
Yeah.
I mean, I think that it's long term. I mean, but yeah.
Well, I mean, there's a couple of ways to look at it. One is also there are sort of spaces being generated in Africa. This is one thing I'm tracking, where Russia is very deliberately stepping into, right? Mozambique, Central African Republic, and usually it follows the withdrawal of the French, to be honest. right? And so what do? It's low cost intervention, right? The Russians have gotten very smart about this because what do they need? They need a troll farm, they need some Wagner mercenaries, right? And they come up with a package to support the regime. And in exchange, yeah, there may be some access to natural resources and diamonds and so forth. But this model has been actually quite successful. But they don't do it everywhere. They do it where they view a real gap. So these places, actually Libya, and other places where the Russians are really heavily involved, because their strengths are not the investment that the Chinese bring, right? Their strengths are this array of kind of regime stabilizing services that they and their proxies can bring. So there is a little bit of a division of labor that they can bring different things to the continent. Now, will it be stable? No, I don't know. I can't imagine there's gonna be much stability in Libya, for quite a while. But some of the other places, in terms of perceptions of China, I think it will, for the principal reason that I think the Chinese are learning too. Right? I think they've learned about the backlash in places like Zambia, right? They don't really want to be, portrayed in this kind of light. So they are involving themselves in domestic politics. Now, sometimes they fall over themselves and they trip up and so forth, but there's learning there going on. But again, any area where these traditional liberal ordering powers are ceding or withdrawing from are going to be interested in alternative patrons.
You have time for another question? Hi. Sorry. Seems like. There we go. Gentry Jenkins. I'm a visiting professor in political science department here. In the setup for your book, it felt like it had a lot of similarities or kind of went along in line with, for instance, Barry Posen's Restraint, Stephen Walt's The Hell of Good Intentions. Obviously, I understand the scope is a little bit different in that you're looking at kind of order in a broader category than just U.S. foreign policy or U.S. grand strategy. But the reason I bring it up is that both of their recommendations, kind of their ideas, the fundamental problem is, that the United States has kind of tried to pursue primacy and kind of spreading liberal ideals abroad in too aggressive a manner, and that essentially we had this moment post-Cold War and we blew it by being too expansive, too aggressive, too ambitious. And both of their policy recommendations are, in essence, we need to step back. In terms of Barry Posen, it's this idea of restraint, that essentially we need to step back so that our allies step up. For Stephen Walt, kind of a similar recommendation. This seems to work against potentially what you would recommend, which is that's going to open the space for alternative orders to come in and say, hey, U.S. is backing up. So I don't want to completely tee it up, but I wanted to get your thoughts.
No, you did a great
job. How would
you
respond to that, and what would you say to them of, you understand the problem,
in fact, I'm going to record this.
But your solution is wrong.
I have a very fraught relationship with the restraint crowd. So, I mean,
I think. Look.
Well, let me.
Yeah, you start.
I mean, I think that yes, you teed it up very nicely. The fundamental problem, I think, with the way that a lot of the restrainers and particularly the realists talk about U.S. foreign policy and talk about grand strategy is essentially a problem of state centrism. And it's not a problem of the world is all, global, hyper globalized and, the state's dead and all that kind of stuff. It's just some really basic things. So for one thing, I don't think there's really a realization that most of the important regimes that the United States is dealing with, yes, they have national interests, but fundamentally they have survivorship interests. Right? Primarily, it's about their first the first interest of Xi Jinping, the first interest of Vladimir Putin is to stay in office, right? And so there's a kind of disconnect because so Barry would think, well, if you just pull all these troops back, Russia will be fine, and you can do kind of your nice liberal ordering in a less aggressive way. But it's the liberal ordering that's really threatening. It's the anti-kleptocracy agenda if it's gone through, which is, I think, absolutely essential. But it's a potential existential threat to the Russian regime. It's the kinds of promotion of human rights. So it's not like I think there's a sort of there's too much of a focus on the idea that state interests are kind of this fixed thing and are what we think about. There's too much sort of thinking in terms of the state when they think about the reaction of other states to US foreign policy. The second way, I think, is that there is not, and this is where I've had fight, Barry's gotten pretty upset with me about this. There isn't, I think, a realization that how many of the kinds of problems the United States faces are transnational and transnationalized. And so, like, as a progressive, if I think the biggest problem, when I think about the biggest threats to the progressive agenda is reactionary populism, right? And that is a movement that is in the United States, it's in Hungary, it's in Russia, right? It's networked with Russians, it's networked with the Liga, right? It's with the National Rally. I mean, so this is not a problem that the United States, I think, deals with by coming home, right? I mean, I think that's a really bad bet to sort of, and then I think fundamentally, I think that, and this is where, it's the straight disagreement. We think that the United States gains a lot of power resources from these relationships.
Right.
We think, again, the state-centric model doesn't really grok the way in which U.S. power is tied up in networks of relations with other states, other militaries.
I think there's a fundamental analytical difference in all those. I put Josh Schifferson in there too, who just don't believe that order is its own thing, right? That it's just a pure function of power politics. And of course, it's highly contingent on power politics, yeah. But it is a separate sphere. And so exactly as you sort of tee it up, if you cede these ordering mechanisms to China or Russia, Saudi Arabia, Qatar, whoever it is, then they are going to transform at an even greater pace, right? And in some ways, the test cases that we have, the WHO during the pandemic, right? Did countries get upset at China? No. Yes, some put the blame on China, but China, in terms of internal WHO politics, actually squashed the review, right, of sort of what had happened, and they manipulated the organization even more. Right? Trump's diagnosis on like China and WHO could be 100% accurate, but withdrawing from it, right, ceded the whole organization, right, essentially to sort of Beijing. And so I think that's also a really fundamental difference that we have, that, this order has been built up and there's enormous resources that go into these various gongos and NGOs and INGOs and IGOs and then so forth, and they're not going to pull those resources back, right? In a kind of, if we retrench. So I think that's the other really basic kind of analytical difference. Yeah.
Should we give a round of applause?
Yeah.